Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today is kind of an oddity because I'm going to go back and paint something very similarly to how I have before, but instead I'm going to paint a slightly different troop type. Now you've seen me convert the plastic Krieg into Steel Legion before, but this time I thought it would be worth grabbing hold of some of the Grimdark. Now this fella, he's a 3D print from Station Forge. I'll make sure all of the links are in the description, and you can cruise along and find one of their licensed printers if you don't have a 3D printer at home. But it's time that we're going to turn around and turn Krieg-themed miniatures into Steel Legion again. So once our print is all cleaned up and assembled, first thing to do is to prime him. And for this I've used Vallejo's Premium Grey Spray Primer. Really any light grey will do the job here. It can be Halford's Car Primer, Krylon, Gracia will also work well. I like the Vallejo stuff because it has a slightly grainy texture to it, which I tend to find helps with paint adhesion while I'm working. But your results may vary, use whatever you've got available. Now just the same as painting the infantry, we want to start with the messiest areas and kind of go from there. Tidy up with each layer that goes on over the top. And same as with the infantry, that's going to start with the jacket. So I've got here Zermisi Desert, and we're going to apply this straight over that grey. Now don't worry, of course, if you end up hitting any of the areas like even his bike, his equipment, or what have you. At this stage, it's more important to get a nice solid colour for his jacket. So you'll find over a light grey Zermisi Desert, it covers very nicely. Now I did choose to apply two coats. The reason being is once you've applied the first, if you get any areas of yellow with a grey primer showing through, it's going to look slightly green, which is not what we want at all. Now, same as with the infantry, we're going to dry brush that coat in order that we get a little bit more detail. So I have here Tyrant Skull and one of my little makeup brushes, something nice and soft. And just lightly back and forth, I might have taken too much paint off there. Now, it's worth pointing out you can be a little more generous with this than you might think. When we shade this, it's going to become quite dark. That Tyrant Skull won't be as prominent. And we can use it as a guide for highlighting later. Alright, now we've got a bit of variation in the jacket, it's time to move on to the other large area of colour. I'm going to paint in the bike with Mechanicus Standard Grey, and this will cover extremely well. You might wonder, why not just start priming the bike with the same colour? Honestly, I think it would make painting the jacket and some of the other details a lot more time consuming. Now, the bike that this is kind of based on, I'm fairly certain this is based on the old Harley-Davidson Liberators. So most of this bike would actually be the same color. It gets spray painted at the factory. So even areas of the engine, just jam your brush straight over there and it will be fine. Only place you need to slow down is when you come near the yellow that you've already painted. Now, getting into some of the areas underneath the engine bay there is a bit of a challenge, but importantly, slow down when you take your brush away from the miniature, because I tend to find that's where I make the most mistakes. I think I'm pulling away, it's not a problem, that's where I end up making those big splotches, so just bear that one in mind. I've got now Longbeard Grey and my little dry brush from earlier, and I am going to lightly flick along some of the edges of the grey areas now. Basically doing the same thing as we were for the jacket. Now this will look crazy bright going on, so mind how you go, don't go overboard with it. But for the same reason, we want just a little bit of variation in colour, and we are going to shade this. So hold your nose. Now that's going to look pretty extreme in most areas, but keep the faith. That is going to look better once we shade it. We're going to move on now, and I have here Dawnstone. I'm trying to find the right angle to show you. We're going to paint in the trousers with this. Now, ordinarily with these guys, I would paint in the trousers with Mechanicus Standard Grey, go for quite dark. But for our Dispatch Rider / Rough Rider here, if we paint his trousers in the same color as the bike, he's kind of disappear. So there's nothing wrong with mixing up the uniforms a little bit. If you look at real world uniforms, they're very rarely uniform. So using a lighter color here is going to keep our miniature from disappearing on top of the bike. Now, a layer paint like Dawnstone, you're going to need to give this 2 coats, but don't worry about that. While that first coat of paint on the trousers dries, I'm actually going to grab here some black. This is Vallejo black and a fine brush. What I'm going to do is just blob in his eyes. Now, there's plenty we're going to do with this later, and the black is going to reappear at a later stage. So it might seem a little funny to be doing them now, but this is actually going to save us a lot of work. You'll see I'm not being careful at all. That will make more sense a little bit down the line. Now we'll move up to Iron Hand Steel, and I'm going to use this for pretty much all of the metallic details. But we'll see here why we've started with the black is because, let's get this in shot here. I want to be able to be quite messy here and catch the rings around the lenses. And you'll see I'm going to hit so much of the mask. But that is a very easy way to paint that now before I have to worry about hitting any of the brown stuff we're going to paint later. With that done, you can then get on to painting all the other silver details. So I'm going to do the lance sections. I'm going to do some parts of the engine in this. It's really up to you. I'm going to stick to a fairly, I hesitate to say realistic, but I guess that is the case. This thing on the back here, I have no idea what this is actually supposed to be. It looks like an outboard engine, like a NOS canister sort of thing, but it's going to be silver. And anything else I want to be silver, let's paint that in now. Now, slowly it seems, we are getting somewhere. I'm going to move on here, and I have German Camo Black Brown, which is a Vallejo color. Thondia Brown or Rhinox Hide would be quite similar to this, but I like the coverage on this one. So I'm going to use this for all of the leather details. One quick blast of this will normally do the job for pretty much everything. So I'm going to paint in leather equipment, straps, his belt, his gloves, all those fun things. And as well, I'm going to get in here and start painting his mask. Now the really important thing here is I don't want to hit his eyes if I can avoid them. I don't mind too much, even though I've just painted it, if I do hit the rubberized stuff around the front of his face, because that's going to be easy to tidy up. Now that's the part which is going to take a little while, because it is going to be quite fussy. Particularly in areas that you have already got down the yellow, you want to make sure that you aren't having to do a lot of tidy up. But don't worry if you do need to, because you can use just a little Zamisi Desert, and we can highlight any of those dry brushed areas later on. What I have now, this is Morghast Bone, and I'm using this on the infantry. I painted in the leg wraps in a grey, but again, I'm looking for ways to differentiate the colors here, because I don't want this fella to just disappear onto his bike. So you can rationalize it any way you like. Your dragoons, your light infantry, your outriders, they just have a slightly different uniform, one which is more interesting to look at once it's painted. Now at last we're going to move on and paint in some of the soft black details. For this I'm using black grey from Vallejo. Eschen Grey or Corvus Black is probably a better match for this. But you'll see why I'm using this in a second. Look at this coverage, just straight on. And I'm going to paint this over the wheels. Probably use a different brush for this, to be honest. Things like the handlebar grips are going to be a good candidate for this as well. And I've also realized I should have painted this over the hoses, because I want these to be a soft material rather than metallic. And as well, I've also painted in his boots with that, because a nice soft black is going to work quite well. Now we're going back to the flat black, the real black, and for this I'm going to paint in all of the armor plates. So there's not really a huge amount of these on most of these guys. His helmet, his shoulder pads, and as well I'm going to paint in the haft of the spear, shaft of the spear that he's carrying. You might be tempted to paint this in a wooden color, but I would ask you, in the Grimdark Future that this guy hails from, do you think there's trees on his planet? What I have now, this is Corax White. You can use a couple of coats of White Scar here instead. What I'm going to do is pick out just a couple of areas where I want a slightly different finish. So I'm putting here the license plate on the front. I'm also going to put down a couple of coats of this on the lamp section at the front here, and the little eagerly skull on the front of his helmet. Just a little warg flesh for the crack grenades he's got back here. And then one more time, back to Iron Hand Steel. I'm going to paint in the rim here on the outside of the lamp. And any other little bits, which, I'm going to do these off screen for the most part, but this is the tidy up stage. So any other bits that you do need to tidy up, so getting out that Zamisi Desert if you have to, this is that point. And now, at last, it's time for the fun part. Now, because somebody will always ask, the pot holder here is a 3D print from a file on Thingiverse. I don't remember which. If you just look for Citadel pot holder, you'll be fine. And same too, you can buy similar online. Just look for pot holder. So let's load up the Agrax Earthshade, big old brush, and away we go. We'll apply this straight into the recesses. Make sure you are working it in there. And yeah, same as always, just cover everything with this gunk. Don't let it pull too heavily, so big areas where it lays a little too heavily, move it away with your brush while it's still wet. Make sure in particular when you get to the bike that you spend a few seconds really getting it in there, because it's going to really stand out if you end up with any parts of the engine that aren't shaded. So hit your camera a couple of times for good luck, and away you go. Let's come back once this is dried. Now we're really getting somewhere. It's time to do a few highlights, and I'm going to start first of all with his armor. To highlight this, I've got Storm Vermin Fur, and just a medium layer brush, because I'm not particularly worried if I do make a couple of mistakes while I'm going along here. What I'll do is just use the edge of my brush to catch some of the very sharp edges of detail, but if I splurge over a little too far, all I have to do is go back with some black. It's actually relatively easy to tidy these up, so don't worry if your highlights are too thick at first, you can fix them. And as mentioned, I did go back with a little black to tidy up those straight edges. Nice and simple. I've got some fresh Dawnstone here, and I'm going to paint over most of his trousers again. So what I'll do is get them in line there, and I'm going to leave just a little bit of the Agrax Earth shaded areas in the recesses, because I want his trousers to be a little brighter than what they are now. And that's nice and quick. From here, if you do want to highlight the trousers further, you can go to a little bit of Administratum Grey, but I think on a model as busy as this, it's not really going to be necessary. What I am turning to is Gorthor Brown, and we're going to highlight the brown leather that we've used. So let's get him at the right angle, and areas like on his knuckles are a really good spot for this, along the edges of some of the leather gear that he's carrying. Along some of the edges of the leather gear that he's carrying, just enough to catch those corners a little. And if there's anywhere in particular on the mask that you want to highlight, then a tiny wee splash of this down the center will make that look a little bit more split. And I don't think I'm going to add very much of this at all. Now, if you want to, you can spend a while highlighting the, the spear here with a little bit of Iron Hand Steel, or similar, but what I've got instead is my little dry brush and some Necron compound. And I'm just going to pass over this a few times. So I catch the edges, brighten it up a little bit, and I don't have to spend forever painting straight lines. Now earlier I mentioned White Scar, and this is where this is going to come in handy. A little bit of this just on the shaded bits of white that we've done up on his helmet. Take your time here and little bits on your brush at a time. And as well, I'm going to paint in again the lamp here, and I'm going to white this in as much as possible. I want to try and avoid the silver stuff that we've already painted, but this should cover quite well. As well, I also painted in the license plate there. You'll see that's not the super cool and perfect circle that I had wanted to do, but not a problem. What I've got is a plan. I'm going to add here just a couple of drops of Talisar Blue onto my palette here. Rinse my brush off, and then with just the water left in my brush, add that into the Talisar Blue. And then holding them very carefully so everything is still visible, I'm going to load up my brush again with that little mix, and we'll go ahead and just paint this straight over the lamp here. And while that settles and dries, I have a little Stormhost Silver, and I'm going to use this to pick out just a few of the really shiny silver details that I want to gleam from the viewer's perspective. So just a little bit of this right at the corner of the lamp here, and a couple of little dots up on his mask here will also give this a nice sharp edge. If you want to, when that contrast is dried, just grab your little bit of white scar that was left over and just put a couple of dots up in the corners of the ring. I've decided I am going to grab a little bit of Administratum Grey, and it's because I am going to highlight the trousers. I've eventually decided, you know what, they will benefit from just a little extra detailing along some of the edges. But as well, we can also use Administratum Grey to highlight the corners of the bike. Just a little bit here and there to pick out some of those corners, and that will be plenty. And now we're at the final stage. What I have here is Ushabti Bone, but this is the air version. I tend to find this flows off the brush a little more easily, and you don't have to thin it out quite as much to get a nice effect. What I'm going to use this for is to find just a couple of areas of the jacket and really catch those corners with something nice and bright. Now this will go on looking much brighter than it will actually dry to, so don't worry too much. It looks like you're overdoing it. And as I mentioned earlier, you can use your dry brush as a guide for where to highlight. Alright, I lied. One last detail. If you're ever going to have to paint script, the easiest way to do it is to grab some contrast. I've always found Black Templar to be a really easy way of getting writing on something. So instead of trying to painstakingly paint actual words, what I'm going to do is just wiggle, wiggle, squiggle, wiggle, wiggly, woo, like so. Then what I'm going to do is take him outside. I'll hit this fella with a matte varnish and apply the base as usual. I'll include the description, the recipe for that one. Let's get a look at what he looks like when this fella is all finished. And there at last, our Armageddon themed trooper is complete. Now I reckon that a little splash of gloss varnish on the lens and a little bit of green on the base will do a huge amount to elevate this to something which is much more pleasant to look at. You might remember me mentioning cutting him in half with the colors, so his jacket instead goes beige, then to his gaiters, and then to the earth that he's driving around on. That color scheme just travels nicely from top to bottom, and I think it makes that bike a little more interesting. While you're dry brushing your base, make sure that you're getting the last bits of that tyrant skull off on the bike, and then you don't have to do any extra work to highlight it. It looks pretty swish. So as always, thank you very much to Exit23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my wonderful producers, Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support means the world, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.